topics. Is there anything big and exciting, Larry, that you'd like to discuss in your unrelated to the topics at hand?
Yeah, yeah. I think the biggest thing that's going on these days is stuff that I've written about, like in Creating Chaos, which is discussed international political warfare, or it's we're seeing it now. I mean, that book was really my foray into looking at long-term patterns of empires and nation states and how they relate to each other and how we can never get away from it. Like how it always sucks us back into the same traps over and over again, which is kind of me channeling my cultural anthropology background. And it it was a daunting book to write, and it's not a fun book because of just that. It's sort of like how can we get sucked into this constantly? Is this just like basic human nature? And now that we're continuing to see it in Ukraine, we're seeing it in the Middle East, we're seeing it, everywhere there are, spheres of influence that just can't seem to coexist with each other without degenerating into ultimately into warfare. It's like first it goes through cycles of political warfare, deniable warfare, and then finally it's end up going physical. So that's good. We're kind of in a space away from my political assassination stuff for a while, and that's certainly taking my attention.
Do you have any real insight on what you see in Iran and Israel? Do you think that's a peace deal that's going to pan out, or do you think it's just all political theater at this point?
I think it's political theater. One of the things that makes it especially confusing, though, is, I mean, for the last, I mean, we've all looked at the Middle East, if you will, that broad area as competing spheres of influence for a long time, dating back to the British and the French empires. I mean, we have to face the fact that a lot of the compartmentalization of territories, as we see in Syria and Lebanon and Israel, is is not natural to the cultures of those regions. It's not natural to their own regional empires developed over history, and those were artificial geographies that were imposed on the region during the period of Western empires and continue to be imposed as the Western empires that were just basically political degenerated into economic empires, a lot driven ultimately by oil. But I don't see how there's a short term in terms of decades resolution over an artificial construct, which is what we see, an artificial construct with all of those nation states that really are struggling for their own spheres of influence now. And you tend to think that they're religious, uh, as in Saudi and its followers aligned against Shia and Sunni Muslim beliefs in Iran. But that's just part of it. Obviously, that also translates to the political leadership of those spheres of influence. And that's where the basic contention lies. It's underneath there are spheres of influence that the former Persian Empire out of Iran tends to drive as versus the rest of the region. And and just because you've uh, destroyed their immediate nuclear aspirations, that doesn't change any of that. That's the politics of the day. That's the situation of the day. Certainly doesn't involve anything between Saudi Saudi Arabia and Iran, or between Israel and Iran. Uh, it it didn't get solved in one afternoon, like some people would like to think it did.
Yeah, I get that. Do you, do you have, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot. So if you don't want to answer, you don't have to, but do you have any opinion on the Israel Palestine issue? Do you think,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I mean that goes back to just what I was talking about. Again, that's an artificial thing. Uh, it's an artificial thing imposed over a lot of territory, over centuries. Uh, Israel, what we're seeing at the moment, I think, would there have been a period of time where you could have resolved that artificial construct with Israel versus the West Bank versus Gaza versus Lebanon, for that matter? I think there probably was a period of time where it could have been resolved. Unfortunately, it was not to the interest of Iran and its aspirations to influence, or for that matter, to Turkey and its aspirations for influence within the region, for that to happen. And that time has passed now, and it looks like Israel, for leadership purposes, for literally political purposes, has now put itself in the in essentially establishing its own military empire over the region for self-defense, if you will. Uh, it's hard to question that, but that's gonna have to shake out within the next 2 or 3 months, because if Israel continues its position of demanding airspace control and the ability to strike any threatening targets across Syria, uh, into Iran at any time of its choosing, I mean, that would be a constant destabilization of the region. It's just, that would be a new type of sphere of influence that would just establish this conflict forever, regardless of Gaza and Palestine. This is something new to Israel, projecting that kind of military power at that distance. So that's going to complicate matters even more than for Gaza, although it looks like Israel is is now taking a position of more or less integrating Gaza, if not the West Bank entirely, into its own, essentially its own political control. The news from today suggests that. So it appears what we're seeing emerging is a new extended sphere of influence, uh, that's brand new in the area. And that's, again, the tendency to think is that would simplify matters perhaps through force, um, but it hardly ever works that way long term.
Have you ever heard of the idea of like the Greater Israel Project? Is that something that you think is a real thing, or?
I mean, this sounds like that. It feels like that. Certainly, the ongoing battles with the West Bank settlers and the violence that's ongoing there sounds like the Greater Israel concept. Um, you know, how much of that is really going to drive Israeli foreign policy? If you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have said probably not. But with Netanyahu's current positioning, the real question is, how far would he pursue something like that to retain leadership power? A lot of this comes down to, what political leaders will do to maintain their own power base, which is, again, usually short-term solutions. But yeah, it's beginning to have that feel, uh, to me, where it did not real that didn't that seemed, actually, at one point, the Abraham Accords, the concept of that perhaps seemed more likely than this. Now I don't find either of them particularly likely.
Do you feel like when you hear like Netanyahu has basically talked about Iran being weeks, months, or whatever for at least pretty close to 35 years roughly or so, and I think that I've even seen reports, I don't know if they're true or not, that it may have went back even to the 80s. um Do you get the same feel from that you did from like the Cold War, the constant threat of always going to be the nukes dropping and all that kind of stuff?
It feels very much, that feels very political to me. Yeah, it's, and we've been through this before. I think the surprising thing to me is that, for example, we saw it in Iraq, you know, and especially from a U.S. perspective, the threat of nuclear weapons in Iraq, biochem weapons in Iraq, ended up getting the U.S. involved there, and as it was being proposed as a existential threat somehow to the U.S. that sucked us back into the region. Now we're hearing the same language about Iran. I guess the amazing thing to me is we went through a period of time where the same thing was said about China, and there were frequent drives and initiatives to get the U.S. to do preemptive strikes against China to prevent them from developing atomic weapons. The same could be true for Russia. We certainly considered preemptive strikes there. It always seems to be like the next country in line that might develop, atomic weapons is a subject for preemptive strikes. Yet in neither Iraq or Iran were they directly threatening the United States. The one country that did go through atomic development and constantly threatens the United States is North Korea. Yet we haven't preempted them. That's been discussed. So it's kind of interesting who we end up actually taking military action against versus who we don't. And that would have included Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. No, we didn't. But Iraq and Iran, yes, we did. So you have to question, is there something unique about an existential threat of atomic weapons out of the Middle East that doesn't apply to these other countries?
Do you worry that these are real threats, or do you think it's more of a propaganda campaign?
I certainly see that it's a political propaganda campaign. I mean,
Right.
if you're talking about real threats, real threats from atomic weapons, from dirty bombs, from those threats always exist. They don't even require weaponization. They require, you can make weapons of mass destruction out of almost anything, and you can use them in a very asymmetrical fashion, as we have seen in multiple places at multiple times, whether it's the subway system in Japan or the subway system in Madrid, for that matter of fact. There are always threats from asymmetrical weapons. Do I think that either Iraq or Iran would have developed atomic weapons that they could have used against the United States in strategic nuclear attacks with delivery systems? No, and I don't see the motivation there. I think the motivation would have been much stronger. And actually, if you want to consider real threats, the real threats of the Soviets doing something like that in the 50s was much stronger. And of course, we considered but did not preempt that. So again, a real answer to your question is I don't see it as a real threat, nor do I see it as the only threat among many. I think we just tend to get hung up on the word atomic, where that is certainly not the only kind of strategic threat we should be worried about. If anything, you should worry about making enemies that can do strategic attacks with everyday type weapons.
Yeah, I get that. Just had a great question, Larry, and it just slipped my mind right as you finished. It's amazing how that happens to me sometimes. Do you feel like you've seen the conspiracy stuff on YouTube, I'm sure, about how nukes aren't real? Have you seen any of that or heard any of that crazy
I have not,
stuff?
but I have not, and I'll be perfectly banned. I think it's fascinating. I have now achieved a unique status, almost unique, of having been banned from YouTube for life
For
for
real?
for unknown reasons. Absolutely, I don't understand it. Don't know why. My days of looking at like wombats in Australia and kittens are over. That's really depressing me at the moment, but it's actually freeing up a lot of time. But no, they they gave me warnings and I did appeals, and finally got to the point where they just tell you violated one of their dozen sets of rules. You have no idea what it was. So I'm out. So I have not looked at that. But as far as nuclear weapons being real, there is no doubt nuclear weapons are real, and atomic weaponry is real, and atomic physics is real. Um, you know, uh, about the only thing that's not real about that is unfortunately how relatively easy it is to make one. Um, and if you go back and look at what we published in 1946, talking about how we made the weapons used against Japan and literally kind of put it out there for the world so they shouldn't be afraid of us, we gave everybody the key of how to make them. Thought we were being nice guys and it would make people feel good. And essentially, what we do is published a primer. But nobody has had, with the right resources for enriching uranium, has had a problem with making enriched uranium bombs, atomic weapons. And it's even easier and a lot nastier to enrich it not to critical mass, but less, to make dirty bomb weapons, just essentially explosive devices with radioactive material and spread it out. So, no, I have not seen those particular foes, but everything I know about the history of atomic weaponry tells me unfortunately, it is real.
Right on. I think a lot of that comes from it's more of this, maybe more of the speculation that the videos of the nuclear blasts are faked, because I think they're claiming like that when the houses blow away, how's the camera still standing there? It's kind of like the moon landing. Who
Oh,
took
okay,
the picture? If you get what I'm throwing down, kind of thought
yeah, yeah,
process.
yeah.
Um,
I Yeah,
oh,
okay.
go ahead.
I'm with you. But I mean, considering that, let me put it this way as an example for some of those particular tests in the Western deserts, we literally had thousands of Army troops deployed around those tests just to test blast effects on trenches, and and bottom line, a lot of those people, unfortunately, over time suffered the effects of nuclear radiation
Right.
to some extent. I mean, there's just no doubt that a sufficient number of people have seen and been exposed to atomic explosions and atomic radiation to doubt that that exists. Now, a particular film, yeah, I can see why people might speculate at that, but it is also not at all. It's challenging, but to set up instruments that can monitor the test and withstand the blast damage, so uh, personally, I don't question that particular footage, and I think I enjoyed it in the Indiana Jones movie where they reused it for that matter.
Right on. Do you think part of the reason that we gave that info to the rest of the world was kind of the mentality of like, if everybody has a gun, no one's going to use it?
Correct. If we this is I think it was very well intentioned, and that we at that point in time there was a great concern that our sole possession of atomic weapons would actually feed the quote unquote worldwide communist conspiracy, because it could be used as propaganda that we were immediately going to use them to dominate the world. Okay, we've got them, you speak up against us and we'll just eliminate you. So it would be better not to uh, oppose the American empire that you think is going to evolve. So yeah, I think it was very well intentioned. It was like, if we show you all how to do them. We're not retaining a monopoly. And we followed that up. I mean, quite seriously, there were serious outreach under Truman and Eisenhower to allow open skies, to allow free inspection. With the Soviet Union, there were very serious proposals for UN control or worldwide control of atomic weapons, which the Soviets just viewed as a ploy on our part and didn't respond to. But yeah, I think it was quite well intentioned, and it just didn't work.
Do you fear like a attack from one of our enemies more, or would you, or do you consider false flags a reality that we have to kind of deal with too?
I feel it's possible. I don't really fear an attack from Russia or China directly against the United States, nor North Korea or Iran for that matter. I don't see those because I know a lot of people argue against mutual assured destruction, but one of the advantage of having atomic weaponry is it really does discourage anyone thinking that they can destroy you and get away with it. I don't like that. It's not a good scene for the human species, but that does appear to be the way it is. And strength against strength has always worked as deterrence. So I don't fear that. I fear much more smaller attacks that are driven by rage, by religion, by small groups, maybe overseas, maybe inside the United States. I fear more attacks against quote unquote Americans than against America as a nation. And to the extent that we alienate and essentially make people madder at us, I think that's more likely to occur than, North Korea, whatever they may be, is not stupid enough to fire 2 ICBMs against the United States. I just, and if they did, that problem would be resolved almost immediately. So I guess that's my answer to that is no, and I'll just go out on the limb, and I think the whole concept of this so-called Golden Dome is the most colossal waste of money that I could ever imagine. Having lived through Star Wars and knowing the technical issues related with all of that, it just shows you how far paranoia can drive you. I'd be much more concerned about an AI-assisted drone storm going after us at 1,000 feet in the air than I am about a wave of hypersonic missiles.
Those drones, if you watch some of the like video from Ukraine and stuff, that's pretty terrifying if you really think about it. It almost gives you I don't know, Terminator vibes or along those lines.
And we do have evidence. I think it's pretty clear now that we know, and I'm not afraid to say that China has tested drone swarms against us militarily. There have been incidents with Navy carrier groups out in the Pacific that have been swarmed by drones that are almost certainly were being tested by China. There have been drone waves in and around our ICBM fields that most likely were tests of capabilities by China. And the thing about those sorts of attacks are the fact that they can be deniable. You could carry out a drone storm attack against any facility and never have it traceable. And actually, that was one of the concerns way back in the beginning of the Cold War, was that somebody could have smuggled an atomic weapon by ship into New York Harbor or Philadelphia Harbor or something like that, exploded it, and cratered the U.S. economy by taking down the stock exchange, and you would never be able to prove it. ICBMs coming in on the radar from their launching parts, you know what's going on.
Right.
But things like dirty asymmetric weapons, you don't. So yeah, the drones the drones and American airspace control bother me a whole lot. You know, missile attacks. Yeah, some small capability. It would be silly to argue against that for somebody going off their nut like North Korea, but mass attacks. That's back to the mutual assured destruction thing again, and
Right.
I can see sustaining that. I don't consider myself a warmonger, but I can see sustaining that. Whereas the Golden Dome is something totally different and addresses the wrong threat.
Right. Does any of that stem from what you viewed from Israel's defense dome, or is that just purely something unrelated to that?
Yeah, I think, and I think that's where it's being mapped in the wrong way. Israel was defending against essentially a local. Israel and Ukraine are very much the same in that regard. Both of them are close enough to their adversary to be subjected to continual bombardment by short range missiles. I mean, they are, yes, they're ballistic missiles. They may be hypersonic missiles. Of course, any ballistic missile is hypersonic, but you can build an intermediate range ballistic missile pretty cheaply. You can build them in mass and you can launch them. You know, if Canada or Mexico decided to do that, it would be another story for us. But one of our advantages is what applies in Ukraine versus Russia and what applies in Israel versus Iran or Yemen is a totally different story in terms of the nature of the threat. So yeah, I think I think that was a very real thing for them. Although we're even seeing that, you know, even though you have the technology, if the other guy can build more and wear down your interceptors, which we were beginning to see in Israel. Iran was beginning to get more interceptors through. So is Russia. When your ratio of interceptors to incoming missiles starts to decline, you're into trouble, and it gets extremely expensive. You know. So, quick answer to your question is: I think we have taken Israel's experience and maybe Ukraine's experience, and it's the wrong lesson to be learned from that. Certainly, you do need ballistic missile interceptors in some quantity, but those are different types of missile attacks than we would face here in the U.S.
Right.
Hopefully, unless again we upset Canada or Mexico to some extreme extent.
Yeah. Do you feel, like back in the early 90s, late 80s, as a kid, I think I remember that them trying to convince us we'd be safe. We had enough stuff to knock down the Russian missiles, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then we started having, I forget, was it late 90s, early 2000s when they started having problems or saying that those weren't great on the West Coast and stuff like that. Do you feel confident with our defense setup?
I think what we've got right now is we've got a number of interceptors in Alaska and a number on the West Coast that would deal with something really random, like, you know, Kim or someone decides, you know, for a political effect, they're going to send something, you know, one or two missiles against the United States. And what the same would be true. We have a lot more capability now with our the missile interceptors that the Navy has on board ship. We can handle larger threats, but where you see them used and useful is not for the continental United States; it's overseas, like we just saw in the Iranian attack on our base in the Middle East, where the missiles work quite well. We just consumed a fantastic amount of money in missile interceptors to take down the Iranian launch. The systems, the Patriots work well. It's just, again, in something like an hour, we chewed up an awesome amount of money in those interceptors that we've got to rebuild.
Right.
But for your question, the interceptor technology for those types of ballistic missiles, again, relatively short range ballistic missiles as something totally different than intercepting a mass launch of hundreds of multiple. Those are not multiple reentry warhead carriers. They're one missile, one warhead. When you get up into the scale of Russian or Chinese ICBMs, there are multiple reentry vehicles where you talk about one missile carrying a dozen hydrogen weapons along with an equal number of decoys. Defending against that is something to, that takes you into the Golden Dome scenario, which is
Right.
technologically exponentially more difficult than what the Patriot is doing. And the so-called THAADs, the theater air defense missiles.
Do you feel like do you feel like that was just drone stuff then when we were having those UFO sightings on the East Coast?
No. Yes and no. I think some of the stuff off the West Coast in particular, over the Navy groups, and some of the stuff on the East Coast were absolutely drones, and they were surveillance devices, and it was not dissimilar to some of the balloons that were flown over the U.S. a few years ago. That's a totally different thing than the really unconventional, 100G acceleration, disappearing out of sight instantly, maneuverable. Yeah, those things are something totally different than what we're seeing, flying in and around the ICBM, or what we saw in New Jersey, that sort of stuff. When they're just flying around after dark, observing you, yeah, maybe can go 100 miles an hour, a few hundred miles an hour, which suggests they might be militarized and weaponized drones, but they're still drones. They're not. Yes, they're unidentified, but they're not what we refer to as like unconventional aerial objects. These are just something somebody's got that we're not able to contend with at this point. And not that we don't have the same thing, by the way.
Yeah, I get that. Do you ever think like do you worry about false flags being used against us to get us into wars in the near future?
I don't worry about it. Interestingly, I've spent a lot of time studying false flags, and false flags are pretty, how do you put it? False flags are generally not that sophisticated. If you want to look at a classic false flag, false flags are the precursor. They're not to trick you to get into war. They're used as an excuse for somebody else to launch a war. The classic false flags were used by Hitler in Poland and in Eastern Europe, where he would use, an attack against German citizens to make a claim that he had to intervene to protect German citizens. Russia is exceptionally good at that kind of false flag. They did it over and over in everywhere from Georgia to most of the former Soviet republics in Eastern Europe. They did it in Ukraine. So false flags are a device that the aggressor usually uses. They're not because they're not tricky. They're solved pretty quickly. It's kind of, well, I see what you did there, but by that time, they've already taken the initiative and they just maybe slowed you down in responding to it. That's always the game. It's like, there seems to be an excuse for this, so I'll slow you down in making an immediate response so I can proceed with my plan. I have seen things posited as false flags that I'm really questionable about. I think false flags are kind of like mysteries. They're intriguing, and they can be so convoluted that you kind of think, well, surely people are using that over and over again. I've seen a couple of instances where they were used in regard to regime change. And the U.S. was using them in regard to regime change, where we would be working with a revolutionary group to overthrow a communist regime, and we would play some game like you know, ship in weapons or stage a you know a not real massacre or something like that, that to trigger popular opinion, to trigger the revolution. Um, so it's not that they don't exist, but I see them. I don't see them as much of a concern as other people appear to. I see them as kind of like a simplistic device, um, more than something really to concern myself about. I deal with false flags all the time, and I don't see them. They don't concern me as much as something that we talked about just earlier. Though, like these spheres of influence and people pursuing their own agendas and staging incidents to make somebody else do something, may react to you or not react to you. Um, that's probably a long-winded answer to your question. So your real question was, do I see false flags as being frequent or a big deal? And no, I don't.
Right on. I appreciate it. Do you, politics aside, do you have any concern that bad guys have entered the country through illegally and are posing a threat to our safety in the near future?
Oh, I mean, historically, I mean, we know that can happen. We saw that happen with Saudis entering the United States and taking courses on commercial airline simulators before 9/11. You know, regardless of how you feel about 9/11, that absolutely happened, and those same people were involved in it. You can go wherever you want to with that. But certainly, uh, probably the biggest flaw with our system that I've seen is people being allowed to enter and then not having to go through a process. In other words, not being it's not just not being effectively screened, but not being effectively monitored, and there being no reaction in place when they drop off the radar. That is very troubling. Does that happen in huge volume? I'm not in a position to see the numbers now, um, but there's a difference. There's a difference in that. I think one is that you're talking about really dangerous characters who are coming in with intent to do damage to the nation through asymmetrical warfare. You know, whether it's sabotage or attacks, something like that, versus just literally people coming in who are undesirable, and they're criminal elements, if you would. That's probably the biggest example of that historically that we've seen, is that at a particular, it was referred to as the Muriel boat lift, when Castro decided the simplest way to deal with a lot of his criminal element that he had in prison was to say, oh, by the way, okay, I'll let you immigrate to the United States. And the United States, wanting to get there being a lot of pressure to take in anti-Castro refugees, took everybody without the appropriate screening measures. So do I see threats there? Yeah, it would be silly not to see them. We've got the history behind that sort of thing. It's just we have enough history that so we should be able to differentiate one type of threat from another and deal with it. And it doesn't seem like we can settle down and just deal with it in a rational, case by case, process driven basis. It just gets to be so emotional. You just don't deal with the very fundamental problems that you could.
Do you feel like the situation in the Middle East? I mean, is it fair for me to say that we've probably contributed to that problem with who we side with one day and who's our enemy the next?
There is no doubt we've contributed to that problem by. I mean, let's face it. Let's look at us and Iran, just to be very straightforward about that. Um, in my book, shadow warfare, I go through the whole history of Britain and the United States intriguing and involving themselves with the governance of Iran. I mean, we overthrew governments. We took pride in overthrowing governments. It's sort of like we protected them from the communists by making sure that we overthrew an elected government and put the Shah of Iran back in control. So over and over again, we have interfered, for our own benefit. It's not like we were protecting the world and ourselves from the communist menace, so we did that, and we were unambiguous about claiming victory for it. Articles were written that, well, we did the right thing. So yeah, absolutely. As I said in the beginning, the French and the British started it by drawing lines where lines never should have been drawn, as in is Israel for that matter. Um, but that's just one example. But all of us have intervened for economic purposes and political purposes to destabilize governments and put the people we wanted to in power for whatever reason over and over again until they just all got tired of us, rightly so. And so that none of them trust us, probably rightly so. So, yeah, we bear a lot of that burden. Now, left to themselves, we can look at their history of their empires and their interceder rivalries, whether it all the way back to Babylon or the Persian Empire, or, it's not that they will do a better job for themselves or a nicer job for themselves, but at least they wouldn't have anybody to blame on but themselves.
I hear you. I hear you. Do you wish what do you feel like you'd like to see? Do you want us to get heavily involved in any conflict with Iran? Do you worry that would lead to other conflicts with like Russia and China, maybe, or whoever?
I don't think that we really, no, I personally, I don't want us to see getting us involved in those conflicts at all. I don't want us, I think it's fine to try to facilitate dialogues. But again, the more that we get involved, the less we're able to facilitate, because you need a third party broker who's seen as having no skin in the game. And that's not us. The more we side with one party or the other, I think it's foolish to think that we feel that we could be effective. You need a third party broker that has no axe to grind. And the more we become involved, which we have, I mean, unless we really want to go back to being an empire and say, partition it out, and you're with us, and militarily, you're with us, and everybody else is not, and let's choose up sides and fight it out. Unless
Right.
we're willing to do that, no, we don't bring, at this stage with our history, we don't bring anything to the party. We're not smarter than they are. We're not. We do not have any credit that they don't have. When they rely on the Qataris or the locals to set up negotiations, they're better off, frankly, in my opinion. We're just intrusive. Um, there are other regions of the world where that might not be true, but certainly in the Middle East, our history in the Middle East is so tainted. I honestly don't see how we can bring anything to it.
Right on. Do you feel do you want to talk about your archive at all? Do you want to plug
Oh,
that at all?
yeah. I would just say, uh, some folks have just recently. I've been doing this for a long time. I've been researching and reading and writing on geopolitics, especially from a conflict standpoint, the histories of the various conflicts, the histories of American practices, other practices, including Soviet practices, as well as my studies of political assassination, that sort of thing. if anybody were interested in my whole body of work, that's just been put online at a link that I sent you with the assassinations research folks have put it all there. It's kind of overwhelming to me, but if anything I said made anyone curious about, all right, why would I trust this guy, or why do I think he has any insights into all that, you could take up that body of work and make your own decisions. To me, looking at it, it says, wow, 35 years at this, and I think I should just go and take a nap at this point in time. There's way too much stuff there.
Maybe you don't want to answer this, Larry, and if you don't, I can cut it out. But out of all the books you have wrote on all these subjects, how many times have you had to like go back and be like, man, I was really wrong about that?
I think there are two that jump out at me. And we kind of talked about this in a way. The most recent book, The Oswald Puzzle, I really had to go back and look at what I'd written in 2 or 3 books on the JFK assassination, where I had literally taken other people's views about Lee Harvey Oswald, a lot of them very conspiratorial, and kind of folded them into my writing without doing the homework I should have done, or doing the homework you can do now. I mean, when I started this subject back in the 90s, we could not see maybe 20% of what we can see now about the history of the period and the related documents. And so in writing the Oswald Puzzle, I had to reset myself and say, okay, I just channeled a lot of remarks from other people that I in light of what we see now, I need to tell a different story. I need to recant on some of that. That would be the one where I really had to step back and say, okay, I didn't ask the questions I should have. The book that is the least in that regard is Creating Chaos, where I really, in advance of the fact, wrote a lot about American practices and Soviet practices, and projected a lot about what was going on in Eastern Europe. At the time, this would be like 6 or 7 years ago, and tried to look at what Russia had the transition that Russia and Russian politics and Putin were going through and had been for a couple of decades, and project what might happen. And unfortunately, what I projected has turned out to be what did happen. And I wish that one had been wrong, but at this point, I'm not prepared to recant anything on that one, because it was more right than I really would hoped it would be. Nobody saw the leading indicators and responded to the leading indicators, and it just developed into something that should never have happened. But so those would be my two. One, yeah, I need to take it back, and another, I don't.
You feel like that's a Russia deal? Do you feel like Putin just wants to restore the old Soviet Union, or is there just certain parts he wants back?
Putin really wanted to. This gets back to that sphere of influence thing that we were talking about. Putin comes out of that mindset that he is a Russian empire guy. He's a Russian culture guy. He is a Russia as a world power guy. He would have been a Russian empire guy in that period. I don't think he doesn't really care about communism versus capitalism versus that's not his game. Religion is not his game. He is a believer in Russian cultural dominance, maybe not world dominance, but literally in a sphere of influence where Russia deserves to be a power, and historically has. He sees that not as something new, but as something that has been played since the Russian Empire of the czars, and he feels that is right and proper, and it's necessary to Russian survival, and that's where he's coming from. And he was, as a Cold Warrior, as a KGB Cold Warrior, doing dirty tricks and shadow warfare in Germany. He came out of that genre, and he quite frankly took it very badly that the Soviet Union had lost, and he's trying to recreate that sphere of influence. And I should say, for a period of time, he was very, very successful. I've seen no one more tactically successful than what he was doing until he decided to become overtly aggressive, up to the point where he decided he could show Western Europe what was what by shutting off their oil and gas lines. That was the first clue that he was turning away from, good-natured politics and I'll join the rest of the world and we'll take our place, to no, I'm just going to make you do what I want you to do. So the answer to your question is he wants the Soviet Union back in play, if not in name, by influence, and he's not going to settle for anything less. It's a mindset. It's not unlike the mindset for some of the religious spheres of influence. Nothing new, unfortunately.
Larry, if some like young person or person who hasn't really ever paid attention to stuff that was going on is like caught in that whole it's the end of the world, is there any message you would want to share with them?
I would say no. It's you have to be pragmatic about these things. We have faced, literally, we did face at the end of World War II. There were a period of time in the late 40s and 50s where we did face global extermination. The Soviet Union and the United States did consider each other existential enemies, so that you could have had preemptive nuclear warfare from either side, and that would have been that. There was every reason to fear imminent destruction. We're in a different situation now, and actually probably in a more encouraging situation, but that doesn't mean we're in a less bloody situation. So I don't see myself afraid of the same things that I was when I was growing up during that period of time. I see myself afraid of the fact that we just can't resist the temptation to move in that direction. It's like, can we not back off from these mindsets of spheres of influence? China appears to be locked in that, in the Western Pacific at the moment. So now I if I were just coming into I wouldn't see it as the end of the world, or potentially the end of the world. I would see it more as, this is almost like the last gasp of everyone for themselves, and the last gasp. Anyone, honestly, I have to say, people will not like this, and a lot of people won't like this, but it is a small world. There is no longer, you cannot isolate yourself from the rest of the world. You can't separate it as a global economy, one way or the other. It's a global environment. Technology has brought everything closer together. Yes, we are running out of resources. You have to find some way to share them equitably, or go to war over them. The things that are going to drive us to conflict now are not the things that were driving us to conflict before. And actually, it should be easy to resolve them if you just remain rational and don't become emotional over it all. So my advice would be, I think we've discussed this. You gotta set back and not make everything a crisis and not everything emotional. And I long for the return to some kind of logic and compromise, which may not show up this week, but maybe next year, 2 years down the road, 5 years. But I do not think global destruction will show up. It's not going to get real bad instantly, but it could keep getting worse if we don't straighten up.
I hear you. Larry, we're kind of closing in on the time frame we discussed, so I'll just ask you one last question and give you a chance to kind of talk about your latest book, and that would be, has any of the Trump files that have been released or haven't been released, has Has any of that kind of confirmed what you were thinking?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's, again, we're seeing bits and pieces because in most cases, what we're seeing are not new documents. We're seeing new documents with possibly fewer redactions. And so people would say, oh, there are no smoking guns. You really didn't learn anything big. But in regard to specifically the area that I wrote about in the Oswald Puzzle, one of the things that we have seen, and what Jeff Morley, who's a great researcher in this area, is bringing forward, is we're getting more evidence, more documents that actually show that the CIA willfully misled both the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations in regard to their contact with Lee Harvey Oswald prior to the assassination. What they knew about him, what they might have been doing in manipulating him. That's really important to understanding the JFK assassination, because one of the reasons we didn't get a solution to the whole mystery, the whole conspiracy right out of the bag, is the CIA kept obfuscating their connection to Oswald and what they might have known, and pushing back so that certain things didn't get investigated, and people who were in and around Oswald didn't get investigated. And so what we've learned from these file releases is it is now absolutely certain that this wasn't just it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't that somebody didn't know what was going on. Somebody within the CIA chose to cover up that information. And so, unfortunately, it's not answering the questions about exactly what happened yet. It's answering the question as to why we've never known exactly what was happened and what was going on around Oswald that would relate to conspiracy. So, yeah, that has been encouraging, and it's David Boylin and I, who worked on the book, it's kind of led us back to do a little bit of a reset and say, well, we speculated about this, but the information that Jeff is bringing out and that the documents are bringing out say, yeah, absolutely, the CIA, it wasn't just a mistake. They not only misrepresented things to the Warren Commission. When the House Select Committee on Assassinations did their work, they sent the guy that would have known this stuff about Oswald to be their interface with the House Select Committee, and they lied about it. And he lied about his own knowledge of Oswald. So we now know, it's kind of like, you don't have the answer, but you know for absolutely sure where you should have been looking for it.
I get it. I appreciate you coming on, Larry. I know we probably didn't stay on track from what we discussed, but we hit some hot button issues, if you will, and it was a good talk. You're always informative, that's for sure.
And they are just opinions. They're opinions based on what, 78 years of experience and 35 years in most of these subjects, and folks can take them for what they will. But at this point in time, it's sort of like, we have learned a lot. It would be nice if we could face up to some of what we've learned and deal with it kind of rationally rather than letting it drive us. So I'm not unhappy after all this time to share what I think I know. I appreciate you having me on to talk about it.
I appreciate it, Larry. You have a good one.
Happy 4th.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.